Finally, getting back to streams about anarchy. Or no, I need to get back to those too. But streams about philosophy, about Hegel, and this phenomenology of spirit. So it's gonna be looks like it's gonna be a longer video, probably, as these tend to be. So I'm just gonna jump right into it. Last time we left off on the introduction of the phenomenology of spirit, sections 73 and 74. And here is my summary, my recap of the last section. I said, we finally dive excuse me, we finally dive into the introduction. Hegel starts off the intro talking. Why I said talking, critiquing. Goodness. Off the intro, critiquing the skepticism of modern philosophy at the time. He explains how cognition is often seen as either an instrument or a medium that either change and act upon the absolute or filter out much of the absolute. He shows how this belief, which leads us to fear the margins of error, is in and of itself the error. Hegel seems to allude to the famous quote, was it famous at the time? I'm not sure, that we are the universe's way of knowing itself. And he begins to set up the downfall of, or serious adaptations for, skeptic and modern, or skeptic or modern at the time, epistemology. I also make a few comparisons to these points and Don Hoffman's case against reality, as I find it very interesting how Hoffman proposes that we don't really see reality as it is, and that the absolute is some sort of all encompassing consciousness through which we are portals to or embodiments of. So, I don't know if I had an idea of completing that thought, but I like leaving it off there too. But let's see how Dr. Sattler um, mentioned it. He says, in this 30-second video in the new series, oh, we talked about that, yeah. Hegel begins his introduction by examining the standpoint of modern through, I think he meant modern thought. We both had typos, which frames it its relation to reality in large part through epistemology and through epistemological concerns. He points out that the skeptical worries about whether cognition can actually relate us to the absolute depend upon mistaken assumptions, many of which stem from presuming that cognition functions like an instrument or that it is a passive medium. Both of these views about cognition or knowledge lead us into impasses, a sign that we need to adopt or work out a different, more adaptive perspective, more adequate perspective, rather than allowing fear of error to lead us into a mistrust of philosophical activity. So we were pretty much right on the money there. At least we were on the same kind of wavelength, more or less, with that introduction, with that summary. Awesome, awesome. So, without further ado, here we go. Yeah.
This conclusion stems from the fact that the absolute alone is true, or the truth alone is absolute. One may set this aside on the grounds that there is a type of cognition which, although it does not cognize the absolute as science aims to, is still true, and that cognition in general, though it be incapable of grasping the absolute, is still capable of grasping other kinds of truth.
Okay, so we're really gonna have to reread this. Because it's been almost a month since I've read any Hegel since we picked this up, right, since the last video. So let me reread this and get back in that mindset. I had the introduction that gives a good, or the summary giving me a good, recap in that, but I need a little bit more. So this conclusion stems from the fact that the absolute alone is true. I guess the conclusion meaning where we left off before, that people kind of have this um fear of viewing the absolute in a certain way. They either view it as a passive thing or view cognition as a passive thing or as a tool. Both of which, being scared of that error, being scared of where that could lead you can be very harmful. So I think this is where he's leaning. I might be completely wrong. This conclusion stems from the fact that the absolute alone is true, or the truth alone is absolute. One many One may set this aside on the grounds that there is a type of cognition which, though it does not cognize the absolute as science aims to, is still true, and that cognition in general, though it be incapable of grasping the absolute, is still capable of grasping other kinds of truth. Hmm. So basically, saying the fear from before, um, that fear stems from, right, the fact that the idea that the absolute alone is true, or that the truth alone is absolute, right? And today we might see this as the idea of like objective reality. And this is maybe I'm just projecting here, because this is I've been on a little tent on this recently. um but the today we have this idea of, oh, we're just trying to be objective, just looking for objective reality, when it seems that the more we know about reality, the more we realize that what we thought was objective was not, was biased or subjective or this, that, and the other. And one might very much make the argument that there is no objective reality, right? It's more about constantly looking for more, constantly learning more, and never thinking that you're there, that you made it, right? Because there's always more to learn. But anyways, yeah, that seems to me to be similar to this idea that, oh, we can't figure out the truth, or we can't, do this, that, and the other, because the absolute alone is true, right? That's the only way that you can know the truth. But he's saying here, I think that you can set that aside, right? Because um there is a type of cognition in which, um you don't have to, you can utilize it as uh, you can utilize it as a science, as opposed to just the absolute as it is, by itself. And to me, again, the absolute is like this idea of everything that there is, a universe, or even God, right? In a way, the divine, however you want to call it. I don't know. Maybe I'm off on all this. Let's continue.
But we gradually come to see that this kind of talk, which goes back and forth, only leads to a hazy distinction between an absolute truth and some other kind of truth. And that words like absolute, cognition, and so forth presuppose a meaning which has yet to be ascertained.
Hmm. Oh, that was short.
Section 74 left off by suggesting to us that if we look at the assumptions that underlie skepticism about our ability to get to know the absolute through cognition, by actually working, through actively doing science, and not just science in the narrow sense of the term that we use it today, but in Hegel's broader sense of Wissenschaft, science as essentially philosophy, carrying out a systematic exposition that takes into account the human being, their own location in history, all the development of consciousness. We've talked about a lot of this in the preface. So there's a skepticism about that says, well, we probably shouldn't even try to do that sort of thing. And you can still see that around today. That skepticism is going to recur in philosophy and in politics and culture in all sorts of forms throughout all of human history, most likely. So this fear of error reveals itself as a fear of the truth. And here in this section 75, he's going to talk a lot about truth. So we want to get into that. It says, this conclusion about fear of truth stems from the fact that the absolute alone is true,
Hmm.
or that truth alone is absolute. And now, what does he mean by that? That's a great Hegel slogan, and when you whip that sort of thing out, that's exactly the sort of thing that will get people criticizing Hegel and saying, yeah, I mean, look at this. He thinks that the fact that my shoes are actually on, somehow that's the absolute. That's not what Hegel's saying. We have to exercise a bit of charity, a little bit of, thinking things through here, and not just taking easy pot shots. He did.
If I can take my, take a think about it. Like I said before, I think what he means by absolute and truth is like what people think of when they think of like God or the universe, or objective reality, right? The idea that you can have a thing that is everything, right? Whether it be a being or an idea, or even a set of principles that encompasses, you know, all of reality, right? All that there is and ever will be, and all this other stuff, right? We have this idea, even if you're not religious, again, this idea of objective reality, that there is something that is ultimate of everything, right? And our job is to get closer to that thing. Um, that thing, that's what he means by what people assume to be absolute and truth, whether or not that's actually true, right?
Set himself up for something by saying that, didn't he? What does he actually mean? The truest form of truth, where truth is something that's not just, say a proposition and its connection with something, but a deeper form of truth, a more systematic, integrated form of truth, is only really available to us through what he's calling the absolute. So what that means is the totality. And this is somewhere where Hegel is definitely committing himself to something that goes against many other modes of philosophy. So the absolute is truth. One way you can think of it is the system itself as a totality is what is most true. But truth also, if we follow it, leads us there. That's what the second part of that formulation is. The truth alone is absolute. So when we grasp something as true, we can also grasp a kind of falsity within it. And insofar as there's still falsity in this play between truth and falsity within it that we can grasp as conscious beings, something that Plato already noted, Aristotle already noted, the great scholastic philosophers noted. Insofar as we can grasp that, we're not yet at truth with a capital T. We're not yet at the absolute. So he says, one may set this aside on the grounds that there's a type of cognition, some other kind of cognition, that although it does not cognize the absolute as science aims to, see, science, Wissenschaft, tries to grasp the absolute, tries to grasp truth with a capital T by understanding everything as best as we possibly can at this point in history, from the vantage point that we've allowed ourselves to get to, engaging in all that, we can give all these sort of provisos, right? Science tries to grasp that. Science is the kind of cognition that is, in fact, tailored to being able to do that, in part because it's part of the absolute. But there's all sorts of other modes of cognition that we engage in, and don't those also engage with things that are true? That's what Hegel is having his interlocutor say to him. Don't those also deal with truths, with a small t? So he says that kind of cognition is still true, right? Meaning that it actually does meet its object. If I say to you, there is a book here, and that book has 500 and something pages. I don't know, because these aren't numbered here. Let's say it's got 600 pages. If it actually does have 600 pages, we say that's a true statement. It does describe that object. But then you can say, well, who cares? What's the meaning of that? And then we can say, well, it matters because, books over 700 pages cost a lot more money to print. So if we know that, and I'm just making that up right now, actually. But if we know that about this book, that it's got only 600 pages, we know that it's within this margin that we want. So you see, truths lead to other truths. And we can sort of widen out the network of truths and eventually get to something that we consider to be absolute, something that we consider to have meaning in and of itself, something where we don't have to say, well, who cares about that? Why does that matter? So that's true, that's neat, but why do you care? The absolute is sort of the answer to that. But we have all sorts of other types of cognition, all sorts of other getting to know things, all sorts of active, disciplines, which do cognize other kinds, or let's even call them domains of truth. So, want to know about the human body? Maybe get yourself an anatomy textbook, or take an anatomy class. Go to an anatomist who actually doesn't just have that cognition in a textbook, but has managed to make that part of his or her mental makeup. Then they can look at the muscles and skeleton and nerves and tell you something about the human body, right? They are engaged with truth, but it's not truth with a capital T. I've got a few examples here that I thought, I just play around with. Think about mathematics. True. Mathematics is this beautiful discipline, which is very attractive because through it we get to know all sorts of true things. We call those theorems. We can prove them within the system. We can even prove a theorem about the fact that we can't prove all possible theorems within the system. Gödel's incompleteness theorem, right? But that's modeled mathematically, and it's got a kind of beauty to it. So there is truth there. We can grasp that other kind of truth. Cooking. You may say, now we're like going low scale. Well, if you actually think about cooking, it's more than just, a teaspoon of this and turn the heat up to this level and a cup of that. If you really understand cooking, you understand an awful lot of stuff. You understand how flavor profiles work together. You understand something about the history of the spices that you're working with, or the provenance of the food, or how the environment that the wine came from affects the way that the wine tastes. You understand something about human physiology, about how we perceive things. To be a chef is actually to master quite a body of knowledge, whether explicitly or implicitly. Neuroscience, another great example. Everybody's wild about neuroscience these days. I'm always a little skeptical of the claims that get made, but I don't want to worry about that. What I want to say is neuroscience cannot tell you why we do neuroscience. And that ought to concern you. Neuroscience, I don't think can tell us a lot of the things that it claims to tell us. But that's sort of a quibble about how much truth is actually there and how much of it is puffery or reading too much into things. But it can't actually address the sort of dilemma that would be put to it by Socrates in the Phaedo, saying, if I thought everything could be reduced to materialism, and he's not saying it exactly like this, but if I thought everything could be reduced to materialism and just a makeup of configurations of things, then these bones would have gotten themselves the hell out of here a long time ago, and I wouldn't be waiting around to be executed. It just pushes problems further back. And, these are truths. I don't want to say that they're not. Hegel's not saying that they're not either. But if we want to see them for what they really are, then they need to be encompassed within absolute truth. And these other disciplines need to be in some way, not, that the Hegelian philosopher needs to be a chef and a neuroscientist and a mathematician. But he needs to know enough about these things, enough about the available bodies of knowledge at the time, to be able to incorporate them within the framework that he or she is working in. Otherwise, what happens? Here's where it gets really interesting. He says, we gradually come to see that this kind of talk, which goes back and forth, only leads to a hazy distinction between an absolute truth and some other kind of truth. And words like absolute and cognition presuppose a meaning which is yet to be ascertained. This is an issue. Those who are only focused on these other kinds of truth, let's call them truth, small t, and say, well, yeah, I understand that that's not the absolute truth, but I'll let that worry about itself. I don't need to be concerned with that. I'm just going to focus here on my discipline. They don't realize that what they do is thereby elevate that discipline to the capital T, and then they end up introducing all sorts of falsities into it by not actually thinking through what absolute truth or what genuine science would entail. They're just sort of playing around with words, is what Hegel's saying.
Very beautiful, very beautiful. So that's crazy, because that's something that really has been frustrating me a lot with modern day science and things like that, and scientists and academics and stuff like that. Is you have incredibly intelligent people in a singular domain, or even in somewhat related domains or different domains, but they elevate their craft, their knowledge base, their domain, to the point where, oh, they can describe everything from it, right? Like economists do. Oh my gosh, economists are so annoying with this, right? Where they're so good with describing the economy that they think they know human behavior, that they think they understand society in general, and human nature, and how societies can develop because of human nature, all this other stuff, when they don't really know much about psychology. They don't really know much about history of of society outside of economy. They don't really know much about the different behavior patterns that aren't irrational, right? Like it's really frustrating, and many practices do this. Physicists do this. Like I listen to a lot of Lex Friedman, and he has a lot of these folks on his show that are incredibly intelligent and incredibly knowledgeable. But they often speak very, very, very confidently about how society, should be functioned or should be structured or can look like based on the filter through their own domain. All right, their artificial intelligence thing. They see everybody as a through that lens and things like that, and it just gets very frustrating, right? Because I know, granted, I'm not an expert in anything, so I don't purport to know any of that, but I do like to delve into all these other areas and know as much as I can about these different areas, and I can see how something from physics relates to something from economics, relates to something from archaeology, relates to blah blah blah. So yeah, just yeah. Definitely have to be careful of folks who take this little truth, right, and try to balloon it up to a larger one without actually recognizing the need for integrating that with other disciplines and other domains and studies and stuff like that. So very powerful section. And I was kind of wrong and right at the same time. Like it wasn't that Hegel was saying, there isn't an absolute or anything like that, but more like people are afraid of thinking about this sort of thing because they're too focused on the small, on these like singular domains and things like that, or of the idea that they can't, possibly, discover such things, and therefore they should, just focus on this little part and explain everything through that lens. I think that's more or less what he's saying there, but good stuff. Oops.
Instead of troubling ourselves with such useless ideas and locutions about cognition as an instrument for getting hold of the absolute or as a medium through which we view the truth, relationships which surely in the end are what all these ideas of a cognition cut off from the absolute and an absolute separated from a cognition amount to. Instead of putting up with excuses which create the incapacity of science by assuming relationships of this kind in order to be exempt from the hard work of science, while at the same time giving the impression of working seriously and zealously, instead of bothering to refute all these ideas, we could reject them out of hand as adventitious and arbitrary, and the words associated with them, like absolute, cognition, objective, and subjective, and countless others, whose meaning is assumed to be generally familiar, could even be regarded as so much deception. For to give the impression that their meaning is generally well known or that their notion is comprehended looks more like an attempt to avoid the main problem, which is precisely to provide this notion. We could, with better justification, simply spare ourselves the trouble of paying any attention whatever to such ideas and locutions, for they are intended to ward off science itself and constitute merely an empty appearance of knowing, which vanishes immediately as soon as science comes on the scene. But science, just because it comes on the scene, is itself an appearance. In coming on the scene, it is not yet science, and it's developed an unfolded truth. In this connection, it makes no difference whether we think of science as the appearance because it comes on the scene alongside another mode of knowledge, or whether we call that other untrue knowledge its manifestation. In any case, science must liberate itself from this semblance, and it can do so only by turning against it. For when confronted with a knowledge that is without truth, science can neither merely reject it as an ordinary way of looking at things, while assuring us that its science is a quite different sort of cognition that for which that ordinary knowledge is of no account whatever, nor can it appeal to the vulgar view for the intimations it gives us of something better to come. By the former assurance, science would be declaring its power to lie simply in its being. But the untrue knowledge likewise appeals to the fact that it is, and assures us that for it science is of no account. One bare assurance is worth just as much as another. Still less can science appeal to whatever intimations of something better it may detect in the cognition that is without truth, to the signs which point in the direction of science. For one thing, it would only be appealing again to what merely is, and for another, it would only be appealing to itself, and to itself in the mode in which it exists in the cognition that is without truth. In other words, it would be appealing to an inferior form of its being, to the way it appears, rather than to what it is in and for itself. It is for this reason that an exposition of how knowledge makes its appearance will here be undertaken.
Okay, looking forward to that. So I see he's building up towards something. And also it took me a little bit by surprise. I thought he was going to focus on, here's how to, utilize science and everything like that. Well, I guess he's kind of sort of doing that, but through a circumnambulous. Is that the word I want to use? Circumventing, circumstantial? No, circuitous. Goodness, do a different route, right? He's kind of explaining. Oh no, instead of doing all this, instead of doing all that, instead of doing all this, like he's naming all these things that you shouldn't be doing, which I get. But I'm now just like, okay, so what you saying? Like, get to it. Um, but yeah, let's see what Dr. Sadler says.
Section
I'm just being
76 ends
impatient.
with a very important turning point that I want to call your attention to right away. It's a very long section, and there's quite a bit going on, and I'm probably going to have to erase the board about halfway through this. But I want to stress where he's ending up. He says, for this reason, an exposition of how knowledge makes its appearance is going to be undertaken here. So what does that mean? He's going to look at, in this introduction, and then really through the rest of the phenomenology, how does knowledge, how does science make its appearance? Not just how does it show up, how does it, emerge at one point or another in history, but how does that appearance actually develop over time and become something more than just appearance, become essence? This is something that is really central to the entire Hegelian dialectic. So he's peeling back the veil at this point. But first, before we get there, let's talk about all these things that Hegel wants us to consider rejecting in this very long and rather long-winded paragraph where he says, instead of troubling, instead of, let's do this. So what we should reject, he thinks, are these worries, these skeptical worries about cognition as an instrument or medium. Why? Because they make this assumption that cognition is something that's cut off from the absolute, and that doesn't turn out to actually be the case. It's not as if the absolute exists over there in its purity all by itself, and then we have our cognition, which we could do epistemology and scrutinize in all of its respects.
I think I see where he's going now. It took me a while because it's been a while, but that's kind of like where we left off right last time. And I'm so mad that it took me this long halfway through the video to remember all that. But like, yeah, to recall, right? It's not that I don't think he's saying that, oh, we can't use cognition to figure out the absolute or this, that, and the other, or the absolute is unfigurable or whatever. It's more like the very idea that, cognition is separate from the absolute, right? From everything, from truth itself, is in of itself a flaw because cognition is the act. I think that's what he's going to get into, right? The cognition is the act, the process of truth, right? It's the process of knowing, the process of learning, the process of finding truth. So by thinking, by cognizing, by doing science, right, we are doing truth. So truth is an action, is a process rather than a destination, right? It's not that we get to a point where we say, okay, this is truth. No, it's that the process of getting there was the truth. And yes, we have the result, but then we use that again to feed back into the process because the absolute is everything. It's not some place. It is this where we are right now, right? It is everything that we are experiencing and doing, all this other stuff just by living and by exploring, by cognizing, by doing science, we can understand more and more about where we are, about what we know and all this other stuff. So I'm not sure if that makes sense. I think it does, hopefully. But yeah, I like this. Because once again, when I heard, Don Hoffman's theory about consciousness and everything like that, To me, this sounds very much like that. And when I find things like this, right, where the completely unrelated, ideas just seem to merge, right, seem to connect, that tells me that's a little bit of intuition, yes, but it's also a good bit of knowledge foundation building, right? It's like when you're building a foundation, when you're searching for knowledge or whatever, you're discovering things and you figure out, like you're doing science, for instance, and you do your little test experiment, and then you get a result, and you're like, oh wow, this result looks just like that one over there that I did, that somebody else did. Now you're looking at, oh, are these related? How might these be related? So you do another experiment to see how they're related, and then you figure out more foundation. You can build more foundation of knowledge, and that's what I see here. Between Don Hoffman's thing about consciousness and Hegel's thing about the absolute and philosophy and all this other stuff, and it relates to many other things that I've been finding as well. So it's super interesting stuff. Um. So, anyways, let's him get
Before it
back into
actually
it.
engages with the absolute over there. We're already we're already connected together. We're already involved in the process. As a matter of fact,
See?
the process has been
Yeah.
going on for a long time before it, because we call that process history. And epistemology, really, for Hegel, has to be situated within history of ideas or history of consciousness,
Mm.
not the other way around. Not first we do our epistemology and then decide whether any of this history stuff means anything. Because if you do that, you're actually probably going to decide that history doesn't mean anything. But you won't do anything beyond epistemology at that point, which is rather boring. So that's one thing that we want to reject. Another thing we want to reject is assuming that science can't get to the truth. That's done basically so that we don't have to do the work of science. Again, I mentioned a sort of pragmatic feature to this. If you don't actually put yourself into the mix and try things out, even though you're not 100% certain, even though things are being developed, as they're going through, even though they're never completely finished, at least in our experience or our lifetimes,
Hmm.
if you don't put yourself in there and start doing something, start cognizing something instead of just worrying about whether you can cognize something, you never will do it. You never
Hmm.
will, in fact, get to know anything.
And this is, oh my gosh, this is something that I've been working on so much because back when I was like a couple years ago, how long was it now? 2016? I think 2016 where I started all this stuff, right? I was very much a perfectionist type of person. I was like, I had this masterful plan. I'm going to be a billionaire, trillionaire, even going to invent hover cars, going to create super cities, going to change the world and do all this stuff. And I was, formulating a plan of how to do that and trying to study and research and all this other stuff. But at that point, and this was back in 2015 or so, I've already been doing this since like 2005, since I was a child. Like I've always been super ambitious, always been trying to create this plan and all this other stuff. And at that point, I still wasn't anywhere, right? I still wasn't anywhere. Um, and there were a couple other things along the way that made me be more action oriented. But basically around that time, I started getting this idea that you have to be biased towards action, right? If you really want to do things, to change things, to learn things, to know more things, right? You have to be biased towards action. You have to take all your ideas and put them out there, right? Regardless of whether or not they're ready, regardless of whether or not, you are ready. You got to put it out there and start just doing things. And that's what I've been doing ever since 2016. I've been doing this podcast, writing blogs and articles and essays, and now this newsletter, and now this YouTube, and it's all still rough and terrible, and nobody listens to it. You know, I probably could have done a lot better. Probably, maybe should have been more patient. I don't know, but it has definitely helped me to think better. Right, at the very least, and everybody I talked to was like, "Oh, you're surprised you never went to college or this, that, and the other." I'm just like, I just try stuff. I'm not there yet. I'm not nobody, but I really think it's important to just try to think about how you can change the world, or how you can do whatever that you want to do. Me, I want to change the world, so I think about that. um but whatever you want to learn more about, whatever you want to learn, or gain some knowledge of, gain some foundation of, or be good at, you have to go out there and do it. And again, you may not succeed, right? I'm 20. 27 right now, 5, 7, 2016 to now. What's that? 6 years into this, and I'm still not where I want to be. Still not nothing, but it feels good. It feels better than where I was before, at least. I think in my terms. And a lot of people seem to, when I actually, put more stuff out there, and I still get scared, right? Like I've been procrastinating for months about, putting another newsletter out, right? After that big one that I did. I did another one after that, but that wasn't as big. Um, Still procrastinating on like being more involved in LinkedIn and even be more polished here and doing other edited videos and added video essays. Like I really want to make video essays. And I've been procrastinating on that because I've been scared because I've been like, oh, I want to have this thing figured out, right? I want to have it figured out before I dive more into it, before I put it out there. But like he's saying here, you can't assume that you would never get there, or that you have to be at some place before you can do science, because that's just an excuse to not do science. Same thing for posting out videos or doing what I want to do. It's an excuse for not doing it, right? If you want to wait till you get to this moment, it's an excuse. So this is just a great reminder. This was a great reminder for myself, and it's just again amazing seeing these sorts of connections being made. But wow, love it.
Hegel even rejects refuting these ideas and approaches. Now that's kind of an interesting thing. Why doesn't he do a critique of them and say, we weigh the pros and cons and decide, we should look at things this way. Or I've got an argument against them. He's actually saying something more like, look, some people want to be in those positions. I'm not going to bother refuting them because I'm actually going to get on with the work of science. And the refutation will be in showing them that you can actually know something. You can actually do something, that human beings can actually develop to get to know the absolute, or become part of the absolute, or realize that they are the absolute. So these are things he's rejecting. And then he has this interesting passage where he's not saying we're going to reject these terms like absolute or cognition or objective or subjective, and we can think of a lot of other terms in our own time that people like to use. He says, the words associated with these adventitious and arbitrary ideas, the things we're rejecting, and countless others, their meaning is assumed to be generally familiar. So take objective and subjective. And ask yourself, if you have to explain those to somebody else, what the hell do they actually mean?
Mm-hmm.
Can you, on the spot, give a satisfactory definition of those terms? I'm willing to bet that you can give a definition, but probably if you start thinking about it very much, you'll see that perhaps these are not as cut and dried as you think. They're not as counterposed, or they're a bit messier.
Mm-hmm.
Is subjective always bad? Paul Ricoeur says there's good subjectivity and bad subjectivity.
Mm-hmm.
What could that possibly mean?
All right, if I can take a little stab at this, because I was talking about it earlier, objective reality seems to be, or objectiveness, or objective seems to be this idea that you are, getting to a singular truth, right? A universal truth, if you will. That's true in all regards. That's true regardless of how you feel about it or think about it. While subjective seems to be, what is true to you, right? What feels good or feels proper or feels right to you, regardless of whether or not it is to somebody else, right? And that, I think those are probably, functional definitions. But as you'll probably see, as he'll probably point out, um people have different ideas of this. Like, is objectiveness good? Is objective, like I said earlier, maybe objectiveness is not even possible, all right, at least as humans, because everything we think is objective goes through, not only is it from an incomplete view of the world, like we don't have a complete view of the world, no matter how much we have advanced in our science, we still don't have a complete view of the universe. So how can we be objective? But not, in addition to that, the very act of being human means every single thought goes through our emotional context, right? It's literally in our brains. Like it goes through the hippocampus or whatever it's called, right? It goes to the emotional part of our brains before it gets to the calculating part, right? Before it gets to the part that just calculates things and simulates things. So it already has an emotional filter. And in order for us to communicate, it comes back down through the emotional filter. So in the very act of communicating things, right, necessarily biases what you're thinking into what can be communicated, right? Regardless of how you feel, of how you're trying to communicate. When you're speaking, it could be the tone, it could be, your thought that day, it could be how you're feeling or whatever, inevitably comes out in how you speak. And even when you're writing, comes out in how you write, right? And how you were born, how you were raised, and what type of environment, what type of society you're in. And even in language itself, right? The very fact that we have words for certain concepts and we don't have words for other concepts, right? So just trying to speak, whether it's written or verbal, is in of itself a sort of bias, a sort of subjectiveness, right? And so I can make this argument for that there is no objectiveness, and then you can make this argument for subjectiveness being bad at all times or being useless or whatever, right? And this is the point here. It's these definitions, these ideas. You can go on all day about these things, and in doing so, I think what he's mentioning here is that they kind of distract from you doing the actual science, right? From you doing the actual figuring out where we are, what we are, and absolute what that is, and all this other stuff, and stuff like that, right? Because you're in like this small little loop of doing these things, rather than exploring all these other stuff, regardless of whether or not you'd call it objective or subjective, whatever. It's reality. It's there. So you just put it out there, and some other people, maybe you want to put labels on it, but it's just what it is. So I don't know. Very interesting.
And we can say the same thing about absolute. What's the absolute?
Hmm.
Do you know? Do I know? Hegel know? Is it just a word that we kind of throw around there? It's that thing over there.
Hmm.
Well, let's not call it the absolute then. Let's just call it the thing over there. You remember back in the preface when Hegel said, I'm not going to use the word God for a while because that word's kind of, vacated its meaning. I'm going to use words instead like, the absolute or being or, perfection or the eternal. I'm going to use words where we can grip something in there. And the absolute, boy, that's one that you can easily turn into, anybody's shibboleth. It can mean whatever you like it to mean. Cognition, knowledge, something the modern philosophers were obsessed with. What is it? Now, Hegel's not saying that you have to be able to give a perfect understanding of that. That would be actually to be at the end of the system, be part of the absolute. But you do have to have something better than just knowing how to spell these words or throw them around in conversation, to pepper your discourse with. So he says, a lot of people assume that these words, the meaning is generally familiar. But that's kind of a deception. To give the impression that their meaning is generally well known or that their notion is comprehended, their concept is understood, that would be a deception. Remember, what is a notion for Hegel? What is a Begriff? It's this thing that's essentially a self-moving entity where it becomes its own other. So, objective, if we really grasp the notion or the concept of objectivity, objectivity also involves its opposite and its reincorporation of that opposite back into itself, and it develops in history. So, if you can't just have a dictionary definition or, a textbook definition that you're going to use. You need to actually, think through. That's what the notion means. You need to think through what these things actually would mean. So he says, thinking that this notion is comprehended, that it's clear as a day, as a bell, clear as day, is actually a way to try to avoid understanding the notion. It's a way to try to avoid doing work. It's sort of skipping steps, you might say, if you want to think about mathematics, or using cliff notes. So he says, they're intended to ward off science itself. And here we're getting to another term. They're intended to ward off this systematic, wissenschaftliche way of slowly coming to understand what's actually going on. And now I have to do a little bit of erasure. So while I'm doing that, let me once again remind us that when we're using this term science here, that's translating Hegel's German Wissenschaft. And Wissenschaft doesn't just mean the natural sciences as we tend to talk about them, or even just the social sciences. Doesn't just mean scientific method or something like that. It extends to include the history of consciousness. It involves the knower as much as the known as part of what is being known. So it's a little bit more involved than that.
Mm-hmm.
So Hegel's talking about science. And
Oh, I spelled that.
And here he's talking about science and using this word appearance. Now, we often contrast appearance to reality. This is only apparent, it's not real. But appearance is itself a certain kind of reality. We also can talk about appearance as, like, this person has just appeared. The night sky is, the moon has just appeared, right? That means that it's just come on the scene, and now we're perceiving one aspect of it. The moon is over there right now. It's going to be over there later. Perhaps it's low to the horizon, so it's big and blue. And by the time it gets over there, it's going to be smaller and yellow. There's all sorts of things that are going to change over time. Science, when it's first coming on the scene, is an appearance. It's not fully developed as science. That is, it's not completely systematic. It's not completely worked out. It's not completely reflexive. When a science is in the process of being worked out, there will be things that we know, but we're not quite sure why we know them, or we have certain results, and we're confronted with those results, and we're like, how the hell did that happen that way? What does this actually mean? That reflexivity is that process of reincorporation. Hegel talks about this as self-othering and reincorporation of the other. He talks about this in terms of Aufhebung, or transcendence, or overcoming, or sublation is how it's usually translated. But we could think of this in terms of reflexivity. So he says, science, when it comes on the scene, is an appearance. In coming on the scene, it's not yet science in a developed and unfolded truth. It hasn't fully become what it's supposed to be. In this connection, it makes no difference whether we think of science as the appearance because it comes on the scene, alongside another mode of knowledge. So this is another important thing. We have science, and then we have other mode, and I'm going to put the possible plural here, of knowledge. And the connection that we're going to want to know is, what is the relationship between this and this, these other modes of knowledge? Is science counterposed to...
If I can do a little think on this, I think the modes of knowledge provide help the development of science, right? They kind of help you figure out what is there to figure out, and how you know it, and things like that. And through those other modes of knowledge, you can develop a form, like the initial stages of science, the embryo, if you will, and grow it until you get to a point where you have a systematic, like you said, reflexive, kind of system in which you can now use those tools that you use other modes of knowledge, such as intuition, or mathematics, or experimentation, by itself. You can now use those in this system. All right, and a good example of this is like the development of anatomy, right? For instance, before you had a whole bunch of people just kind of figuring it out with like the body at witch doctors, and you had this idea of you put different chemicals or different, feed people different things or cut people different ways, and then you end up with a result. But then we would have come together, um with things like understanding different parts of your body, along with different effects, along with how your environment, along with germ theory, and along with this, that, and the other. And now you can form this science of anatomy, right? Same thing with physics. Or, oh, a better example, a really great example is with astronomy, right? The fact that it came from astrology. Right? People don't remember, people don't I guess they probably don't remember or don't realize that astrology was the way people figured out the stars and navigated and did all this stuff for thousands of years, right? Probably even hundreds of thousands. Like people, we've always been very interested in the stars because it's amazing. And unfortunately, today we barely even see the stars, outside of like pictures, which is tragic, or rural areas. But nonetheless, for most of human history, most people looked up and they saw this amazing cosmic web of stuff in the sky, and it figured out so many things from that, right? A lot of the first ideas of weather, of navigation, of even mathematics came from looking at the stars, right? And yes, that a lot of it was used for things that we wouldn't deem as today as scientific or anything like that, like people's birth dates and how it goes with your character and all this other stuff, and um, what do you call it, like predicting the future, stuff like that, right? But a lot of that stuff we do use in astronomy, in weather forecasting, and other stuff, right? And that's very important to realize. Is like these other tools, other ways of knowing, the other modes of knowledge, helps us to develop this science. And so to poo-poo these other ways of knowledge is to kind of kill the baby in the tub, right? While they're young, when they're when you have to help them develop. So it's very, very interesting here. I like this idea.
Against them, like the true to the false. But these are other modes of knowledge, so they can't just be false then. This is important. One of the things that makes science what it is that it relates itself to other modes of knowledge and doesn't just banish them and say, get out of here, there's nothing to you. But it takes them in and shows to us the truth that these other modes of knowledge are not yet aware of themselves containing. At least that's Hegel's view on it. So he says, it makes no difference whether we think of science as appearance because it comes on the scene along another mode of knowledge that's perhaps better established already, or whether we call that other untrue knowledge its manifestation, saying, well, think about alchemy and chemistry, right?
Oh, yeah,
so chemistry is developing. Through chemistry, we're getting to know the world. Not everything that's science for Hegel is chemistry, right? But chemistry would be a part of it. And alchemy was a discipline. They weren't just puttering around doing, totally random stuff. They had a body of knowledge.
Mm-hmm.
Turned out that some of it was bunk. Some of it was based on, kind of crazy assumptions. Some of it was things that might have actually worked in another field, but didn't work in terms of chemical reactions and compounds and things like that. Because they were interested in psychology, for example. Is the science coming on the scene and just sort of counterposing itself and saying, I'm the truth, you're false? Or is it coming on the scene and saying, we're gonna pull the dross out of you and leave behind the husk, the empty shell, and we're going to take what's good? Hegel says, in any case, science has to liberate itself from just being appearance. How does it do that? Well, that's that unfolding, that developing, that dialectical process, right? It does that by turning against that. For when confronted with a knowledge that is without truth, science can neither merely reject it as an ordinary way of looking at things. Why can't it reject it? I'm going to pause on this for a minute. Why can't science just reject it as an ordinary way of looking at things? Because it is a discipline. If you want to be an astronomer and say that astrology is actually false, even though a lot of people seem to get something out of it, it's not enough just to point out, the fact that astrologers aren't really able to make good predictions. about human behavior, you have to do more than that in order to banish it. You can't just treat it as, well, that's what the dummies or the ordinary people do. He says, science cannot merely reject it as an ordinary way of looking at things while assuring us that its science is a quite different kind of cognition for which that ordinary knowledge is of no account whatsoever.
You have to prove it.
Nor can it appeal to the vulgar view for the intimations it gives us of something better to come. Science actually has to deliver. It can't just say, well, you know, in the future, it's going to be revealed that I'm right and you're wrong, because we're actually here in the present. So, you know, this is a point where we ought to actually think about some of the claims that get made by scientists today about, you know, metaphysical topics like free will, or what addiction is, or, you know, whether we can come up with a science of morality. Those are pretty big claims, and you don't get to make those claims by saying, well, you know, in the future we'll prove that X, Y, Z. If it's real science, you got to demonstrate that in the present. So Hegel says, by the former assurance, by saying, look, this is just garbage, and we're the ones who have the truth, science would be declaring its power to simply lie in its being. But the untrue knowledge likewise appeals to the fact that it is, and assures us that for it, science is of no account. So here we just have a struggle between two things that are, and merely appealing to that's the way things are. These are two different viewpoints on what is. They're both grasping different parts of what is. So that's not a successful way to fight the battle, you could say. So he says, the one bare assurance is worth just as much as another. Still less can science appeal to whatever intimations of something better it may detect in the cognition that is without truth, to the signs which point in the direction of science. For one thing, it would only be appealing again to what merely is. It would just be like pointing out, you know, this is the way things are. This is the way things are in that discipline. For another, it would only be appealing to itself, and to itself in the mode in which it exists in the cognition that is without truth. So if chemistry is going to say, you know, that alchemy stuff, mostly garbage, but parts of it not bad. How do you know it's not bad? Because the parts of it that aren't bad are what we do. Again, not all that helpful to do that. You know, the parts of it that aren't bad are going to allow us to like transform the whole economy, the culture that you live in. I mean, think about the sort of things that chemistry has made possible. Just think about plastic, for example, and what that's done to our entire life world, right? But that was something that was, you know, a far-off idea at one time. It's not something you can appeal to and say, here's my evidence, it's way over there. So he says, for one thing, it would only be appealing again to what merely is, and for another, it would only be appealing to itself, and in the mode in which it exists in the cognition that's without truth. In other words, it would be appealing to an inferior form of its being, to the way it appears, to the way it is at that time, rather than what it is. And here Hegel's going to use an important term, what science is in and for itself. This is a key phrase for Hegel. I'm going to give you sort of a clue right here. When you see that, you can tell you need to underline that part and say, what's been happening right here is a major part of the dialectical advance that we've made up to this point. Because it's usually some sort of consolidation that's going on. So he says, that's why we need an exposition of how knowledge makes its appearance. We need to think about how science goes from being appearance to being something that is fully worked out, that is fully developed, that is fully unfolded, that deals with the absolute as such.
Good stuff, y'all. Good stuff. Good stuff. So another really great section there. And again, how I see this building up is that science and knowledge and philosophy and all that stuff is a process of learning, of growing, of building this foundation of knowledge. And what he means by science is in and of its for itself is like you have to use science to develop science, right? You can't just say, oh yeah, this is science, right? Just like unfortunately a lot of people do today, it's science, right? Believe it. No, you have to show people why. Show people the process and let them go through that process. Let them do that process of science and therefore understand for themselves how we learn these things, why we got here, how we got here, and the limitations, the constraints. I think this is a huge reason as to why science communication is so terrible today, right? You see this, with the whole pandemic stuff. People don't believe it, right? Because they don't believe science, because nobody shows them how this was developed, right? Nobody shows them the science behind it and what that looks like and how you can do it yourself, right? How you can try it for yourself at home. You can do this little test and do this experiment and figure out for yourself, does this work? Does this not work? Instead, everything is a lot of things, rather not everything, because there are some people out there who would like trying to show people, but a lot of things are privatized, right? Put behind IP, it says, or put behind the paywall, or enforced by government. It says you do this because we tell you to, and that just defeats the entire purpose. Because the human mind, we want to find the reasons why, right? Um, and this goes into, I think, phenomenology itself, right? Why we even do science in the first, why we even came up with it, why we even have these ways of knowledge, these ways of knowing, is because we want to know things. We want to figure out how and why and all this other stuff, right? And oftentimes we will come up with some way. We will come up with a reason, regardless of how good that reason is. As long as it feels good, then we often go with it. This is why science is so important, actual science, actually doing science, because it allows us to figure out a foundation of knowledge, right? A truth, that we can back up, right? That we can replicate, that we can then show other people, hey, okay, you don't believe me? Try it yourself, right? And then they can test it and see for themselves. You don't need to depend on some authority, on some intuition that you may or may not have, on some, other thing to do this for you, to do the thinking for you. You can do it yourself. That's so important. I think that's why science has got the world to where it is today, in terms of development. At least there's a lot of bad things about it, not about science. I think what really went wrong with how we are today, the good and the bad, is because of hierarchy, of authorities, trying to say, oh, this is how you have to do things, or this is how this science has to be applied, or this is who has access to it, or this, that, and the other. So it limits, who can do things, who can learn, who can um have this body of knowledge and what you can do about it, right? And that has ultimately, I think, handicapped us as well. But anyways, I'm about to go into my anarchy bad, so let me shut this down. It's been an hour. But yeah, this is another great thing. I need to do this more regularly, so expect, if not one tomorrow, probably won't be tomorrow, next week. I try to do it at least once a week. I do want to do it more than one, um, but at least next week. Um, but yeah, thanks as always for watching, for listening. This was great. Let me know what you learned, what you thought about this. Maybe it wasn't great for you. I don't know. Let me know. Thanks as always, and have a great day. See ya.